Stop what you are doing and pay attention. Serious 5 days. That is all the time Donald Trump gave Iran to respond to a nuclear deal. Not 5 months, not 5 weeks. 5 days. And here is what nobody in the mainstream media is telling you. This deadline is not a peace offer, it is a trap, and Iran already knows it. In the next 15 minutes, I am going to show you exactly how this trap was constructed, why Iran mathematically cannot accept this deal, why America strategically cannot walk away from it, and what happens to your gas price, your grocery bill, your mortgage rate, and your retirement savings in each possible scenario that follows. Pause. 2 numbers before we begin. Oil currently sits at $82 a barrel. Goldman Sachs has already modeled a conflict escalation scenario. Their published ceiling estimate is $200 a barrel, and according to Oxford Economics, a $100 oil shock passes through to consumer prices within 6 to 8 weeks. Your gas pump does not wait for diplomats to finish negotiating. Size. It moves the moment traders price in the risk. So stay with me because this one matters. Here is the short version of how we arrived at this exact moment. No unnecessary detail, just the sequence that explains everything that comes after April 2024. Iran fires over 300 drones and ballistic missiles directly at Israeli territory in a single coordinated operation. It is the first direct state-on-state military strike between Iran and Israel in the modern era. The world holds its breath. Israel retaliates. The escalation ladder, which had been theoretical for decades, begins moving in real time. October 2024, Iran launches a second larger missile salvo. This one marks the largest direct ballistic missile strike against Israel ever recorded. Simultaneously, Red Sea shipping lanes are already under sustained healthy attack. Marine insurance rates have spiked 400% above their pre-conflict baseline. Global. Shipping companies are rerouting entire fleets. January 2025. Healthy operations continue without pause or meaningful degradation. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 1/5 of all globally traded oil flows every single day, begins appearing in every serious institutional risk model on the planet. March 2025, Donald Trump returns to the White House and immediately tears up the existing nuclear framework. Maximum Pressure 2.0 begins. Sanctions tighten, diplomatic channels narrow, the space for negotiated outcomes begins shrinking rapidly. And now this week, a 5-day ultimatum is issued publicly. Accept a new nuclear framework or face consequences that the administration has deliberately left undefined. That is the timeline. Clean, fast, no fluff. Now let me show you the mechanism operating underneath it, because the timeline is just the surface. What is happening underneath it is far more consequential. I want you to imagine 2 cars. Both are traveling at high speed directly toward each other on a single lane road. There are no exits. There are no detours. Each driver has exactly one decision available to them: swerve or hold the wheel perfectly straight. The driver who swerves first loses, not in any physical sense, but politically, diplomatically, and strategically. The driver who swerves has just broadcast something devastating to every observer watching. They have demonstrated that under sufficient pressure, they will yield. And in international relations, that signal does not fade. It echoes for years. In game theory, this dynamic has a precise name. It is called the credibility trap. Now apply that framework to Tran. The moment Iran accepts a nuclear deal under a 5-day deadline, under the explicit shadow of American military assets positioned throughout the region, it does not look like pragmatic diplomacy. It does not look like statesmanship to Iran's domestic audience, to its regional allies, and to every government currently watching this situation. It looks like capitulation under duress. And a government that appears to have capitulated under military pressure does not survive. Not politically, not institutionally, not when 85 million citizens are watching and drawing conclusions about the strength or weakness of their leadership. Iran's supreme leader understands this with complete clarity. The calculation is not emotional, it is coldly rational. Accepting the deal costs more politically than refusing it. So refusal becomes the logical output regardless of what the deal actually contains. And here is the part that most analysts are not saying clearly enough. The Pentagon understands this too, which means the 5-day deadline was never seriously expected to produce Iranian acceptance, which means the real purpose of the deadline is something else entirely. And that something else is where this becomes genuinely dangerous for every person watching this video. The sequence moves like this. Follow each step carefully because the logic builds on itself. Step 1. The ultimatum is issued, and Iran's refusal becomes structurally inevitable. Trump offers a 5-day window framed as a final opportunity for diplomacy. The short time frame is not accidental. A compressed deadline serves a very specific domestic political function. It projects maximum toughness to an American audience ahead of midterm calculations. It looks decisive. It looks strong. But simultaneously, that same compressed time frame makes Iranian acceptance nearly impossible. No government with any concern for internal legitimacy responds to a public ultimatum under military threat without constructing an elaborate face-saving architecture first. 5 days is not enough time to build that architecture. The deadline is by design almost certain to fail, and both governments know this before it is even announced. Step 2. Iran refuses publicly while signaling privately. This is not new Iranian behavior. It is a well-documented pattern. Tehran issues a firm public rejection, protecting its domestic credibility and satisfying its hardline internal constituencies, simultaneously through back-channel intermediaries, most likely Oman, which has served as the quiet diplomatic corridor between Washington and throne for over a decade. Iran sends quieter signals indicating some residual openness to negotiation under different conditions. They refuse the frame while leaving the door microscopically open. They ran this exact playbook in 2019 following the Upkike strike. They ran it again in 2020 following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and they ran a version of it again in 2022 during the collapsed JCPOA revival talks. Step 3. America now faces the escalation dilemma, and this is the critical moment. This is where the trap closes. But it closes around America, not Iran. If the Trump administration does nothing following Iran's refusal, the maximum pressure strategy is functionally finished. The credibility of American ultimatums collapses, not just with Iran, but globally. The next deadline issued to North Korea carries less weight. The next warning delivered to China carries less weight. Every future coercive diplomatic instrument loses a measurable percentage of its effectiveness. In strategic studies, this is called credibility erosion, and unlike military capabilities, credibility cannot be rebuilt quickly. It deteriorates in public view and recovers, if it recovers at all, over years. If the administration chooses to escalate militarily, it enters an entirely different set of problems that are in their own way equally inescapable. Step 4. The mission creep mechanism activates. The United States currently maintains approximately 40,000 military personnel positioned across the broader Middle East region. Analysts at the RAND Corporation and the Atlantic Council have both independently modeled what a genuine sustained military campaign against Iran would require to achieve its stated objectives. The number they arrive at is not 40,000 troops. It is not 400,000 troops. It is 3 million troops. The math behind that figure is not hyperbole. It reflects the operational reality of Iran's geography and strategic depth. Iran has a population of 85 million people spread across a territory larger than Western Europe. Its coastline extends 2,140 kilometers. Its interior is dominated by mountain ranges, desert plateaus, and urban centers that have been specifically hardened and dispersed against aerial campaigns over 45 years of anticipating exactly this scenario. And beyond its own borders, Iran maintains an active proxy network spanning Lebanon through Hezbollah, Yemen through the Houthis, Iraq through dozens of armed factions, and Syria through multiple aligned militias. That network is capable of opening simultaneous fronts across the region on relatively short notice. This is the core logic of asymmetric warfare, and it is worth stating plainly, in an asymmetric conflict, the weaker party does not need to defeat the stronger party militarily. It needs only to survive long enough to make the cost of continued engagement politically unsustainable for the stronger party's domestic audience. Iran has been executing that strategy against American pressure for 45 consecutive years. It has not won in any conventional military sense, but it has survived. And in asymmetric warfare, survival is the victory condition. Step 5. The Strait of Hormuz becomes the central economic trigger. And this is the moment where geopolitics stops being abstract and starts hitting your household directly. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest navigable point. Through that 33-kilometer corridor flows approximately 20% of all oil traded globally every single day. The dependency of major economies on this single choke point is almost difficult to comprehend. Japan sources 85% of its total oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz. South Korea sources 75%, India sources 60%. Even with years of diversification efforts, The United States remains meaningfully exposed through its treaty allies and through global oil price mechanisms that do not care about the origin of specific barrels. Iran does not need to close the Strait of Hormuz permanently to achieve its strategic objectives. Permanence is not the goal. What Iran needs is to create sufficient uncertainty to make insurance underwriters raise rates to levels that make commercial tanker operations economically unviable, to make shipping companies route their fleets, and to keep that uncertainty elevated long enough for oil markets to price in a sustained risk premium. The moment that dynamic takes hold, oil moves from its current $82 toward $120 within days. That is not a projection built on worst-case assumptions. That is the documented market response to the September 2019 drone strike on the Upkike processing facility in Saudi Arabia. A single strike against a single facility which caused a 15% spike in oil prices within one trading session. A sustained Hormuz interdiction threat pushes the models to $150, $170, potentially $200 per barrel. Goldman Sachs published that ceiling. It is not fringe analysis. Step 6. The economic domino sequence begins and it reaches your home faster than you expect. At $150 oil, diesel fuel costs reach levels that fundamentally restructure the economics of transportation and logistics. This matters because diesel is the invisible tax embedded in nearly everything you consume. Diesel moves the trucks that carry your groceries from distribution centers to supermarket shelves. It heats commercial and residential buildings across the Northern Hemisphere. It powers the agricultural equipment that harvests the food supply. It runs the generators that provide backup power to hospitals, data centers, and manufacturing facilities. Oxford Economics has modeled the pass-through rate from oil prices to consumer inflation at approximately 40%. In practical terms, for every dollar increase in oil prices, roughly 40 eventually materializes in the prices you pay for goods and services at $150 oil. That translates to a real-world increase of approximately $27 per month in household consumer costs on top of an inflation baseline that is already elevated above the Federal Reserve's target. At $200 oil, the cascade extends further and faster. Moody's projects a technical recession across the Eurozone within 2 quarters. The International Energy Agency places the probability of currency crises in import-dependent emerging economies, particularly Pakistan, Egypt, Sri Lanka, and several sub-Saharan African nations, at high and rising. These are not peripheral events. Currency crises and import-dependent economies create refugee flows, political instability, and humanitarian emergencies that generate their own secondary geopolitical consequences. Step 7. Central banks are forced into an impossible position, and this is where your savings and your mortgage become directly implicated. The Federal Reserve now faces a policy dilemma with no clean solution. Inflation is rising, driven by an oil shock. That is a supply-side phenomenon entirely outside the Fed's control. The standard response to rising inflation is to raise interest rates. But raising interest rates in an economy already experiencing the early stages of a growth slowdown does not fight the oil-driven inflation effectively. It simply adds a demand-side contraction on top of a supply-side shock. You get slowing growth and rising prices simultaneously. Economists have a name for this condition. They call it stagflation. The last time the American economy experienced a genuine stagflationary episode was between 1973 and 1975, triggered by the Arab oil embargo that followed the Yom Kippur War. During that period, the S&P 500 lost 48% of its value over 21 months. Mortgage rates eventually climbed to levels that effectively froze the housing market for years. Consumer purchasing power eroded sharply and did not fully recover for nearly a decade. Your retirement portfolio has no institutional memory of what that felt like from the inside. But the historical data is unambiguous about what it looked like from the outside. So what actually happens from here? Let me give you 3 scenarios, each with honest probability assessments rather than comfortable hedging. Best case, quiet diplomacy activates before public positions harden completely. Oman's foreign ministry, which has served as the functional back channel between Washington and throne in every significant crisis since 2012, facilitates a series of indirect exchanges. A face-saving formula is constructed carefully enough that neither government needs to publicly acknowledge having moved. Iran agrees to enhanced IAEA monitoring on a modified timeline. The United States agrees to suspend a bunch of sanctions under a different label. No press conference, no handshake, just a gradual de-escalation that both sides can describe to their domestic audiences however they choose. Oil retreats from its risk premium. Markets stabilize. Your gas price rises perhaps 12 to 15 cents and plateaus. This outcome is genuinely possible. I estimate its probability at approximately 20%. The obstacle is not the absence of a mutually acceptable deal. The obstacle is the political cost each side must absorb to reach it under current framing. Base case. The talks stall without resolution and without immediate military escalation. The situation enters a prolonged, ambiguous phase that markets find deeply uncomfortable to price. America applies additional layers of sanctions targeting Iranian oil revenues and the financial networks that process them. Iran responds by accelerating uranium enrichment toward 84% purity, one technical and political step from weapons-grade material. The IAEA progressively loses inspection access as Iran restricts monitoring under provisions of the Non-Proliferation Treaty it has previously invoked. The ambiguity itself becomes the destabilizing force. Oil trades in a sustained band between $95 and $130 for somewhere between 6 and 18 months. Inflation remains elevated above target. The Federal Reserve maintains higher interest rates longer than markets currently expect. Mortgage rates stay painful. New construction slows. Consumer spending on discretionary goods contracts. This is the most likely outcome given current positioning. I estimate its probability at approximately 55%. Worst case, military action begins either through American strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, Israeli preemptive action that draws American forces in as a consequence, or an Iranian miscalculation in the Strait of Hormuz that triggers a naval confrontation. The sequence that follows this trigger is rapid and largely predetermined by the structural factors already described. Oil crosses $150 within the first week. Marine insurance rates for Persian Gulf operations become commercially prohibitive. The largest tanker operators suspend Gulf operations pending clarity. Vessels that had been routing through the strait begin diverting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 14 days of voyage time and transforming the economics of every barrel of oil that was previously flowing through that corridor. LG spot prices in Europe and Asia triple within 30 days. Several European governments declare energy emergencies and begin rationing industrial consumption. Gulf sovereign wealth funds facing dramatic declines in oil revenue relative to budget assumptions begin liquidating holdings in American and European equities to maintain domestic spending commitments. Your investment portfolio absorbs the first shock through equity market declines. Your grocery budget absorbs the second shock through diesel-driven food price increases. Your mortgage rate environment absorbs the third shock. As the Federal Reserve attempts to manage simultaneously rising inflation and decelerating growth, the timing and sequencing may vary. The direction of each impact does not. I assess this scenario at approximately 25% probability. That is a meaningfully higher figure than the consensus currently reflected in institutional analyst commentary, and this is where the analysis arrives at its honest and uncomfortable conclusion. There are only two options available to the United States at this juncture, and both of them carry substantial costs. America can push forward. It can maintain the ultimatum, escalate pressure, and risk triggering precisely the economic cascade described above. A cascade that was supposed to be the instrument of Iranian compellence, but which the structural geography of global energy markets transforms into an instrument of self-inflicted damage. Or America can back down. It can quietly allow the deadline to pass without consequence, soften the framing, and begin a gradual de-escalation process. But in doing so, it permanently diminishes the credibility of every future coercive instrument it deploys. Not just with Iran, with every government that is watching this moment and updating its model of how resolute American ultimatums actually are. There is no third option that avoids both costs simultaneously. That is the precise definition of a strategic trap. And the 5-day pause presented publicly as a moment of diplomatic generosity is the mechanism through which this trap was constructed and closed. The historical precedent that deserves to stay with you long after this video ends is this. In August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident provided the legislative authorization for direct American military escalation in Vietnam. At the moment of that authorization, the projected cost was manageable and the timeline was short. The conflict lasted 11 years. 58,000 Americans died. The strategic objective was never achieved, and the credibility damage from that outcome shaped American foreign policy constraints for the following 2 decades. History does not repeat with mechanical precision, but the architecture of escalation traps, the way that short-term credibility pressures systematically override long-term strategic calculation, has remained remarkably consistent across vastly different historical contexts. Watch 3 specific indicators in the coming days. They will tell you more than any press conference or official statement. Watch whether Oman's foreign minister makes an unscheduled travel to Thrain. Private diplomacy always moves before public announcements. That flight, if it happens, means the back channel is active. Watch the IAEA's next inspection report and specifically the enrichment levels it documents. The movement from current levels toward 84% is the technical tripwire that forecloses certain diplomatic options permanently. And watch oil futures market positioning. Specifically, watch the spread between near-term and long-dated contracts. When institutional money begins pricing sustained, elevated oil into the long end of the futures curve, it means the traders who are paid to be right have made their assessment. They price reality before politicians announce it. Next episode, we turn to the variable that almost nobody in Western analysis is adequately weighting. China has been almost entirely silent throughout this escalating crisis. That silence is not passive. It is strategic, and Beijing's next move, which it is almost certainly already preparing, may be the single most consequential factor in determining how the situation resolves or fails to resolve. Be here for that.